Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. On November 25th, Fidel Castro died, and in days following, the country mourned. His ashes were taken from various cities in a national tour, ending with a big, I guess you could say, not a funeral, but a memorial in Havana. So in this interview, we're going to talk a little bit about what that memorial was like, because our guest was there. But then we're going to talk about what's going on and some of the challenges that are going to be facing the Cuban people. We had a production company do some street interviews for us in Havana, and we're going to play some clips from those interviews and try to contextualize them some with our guest. And our guest is James Early, who now joins us from Washington, D.C. James is the former Director of Cultural Heritage Policy for Folklife Programs at the Smithsonian Institution. He's a board member of the Institute for Policy Studies and the Real News Network. Thanks for joining us, James.
Thank you.
So describe that in Revolution Square, describe that masses of people that came together to say goodbye to Fidel Castro.
Well, as far as the eye could see on both sides of the podium from which I had a vantage point, as well as the depth of the Plaza of the Revolution, it was, fully packed with children and families and blacks and whites and mulattoes, all varieties of Cuban citizens there. It was both a sad event in which there were people who were mourning and in tears, and it was also a spirited event in which people were very elevated, recalling and supporting the principles as were being enunciated by the various people on the podium, international leaders, Jacob Zuma from the president of South Africa, Maduro from Venezuela, Ortega from Nicaragua, a representative from Greece, from Iran, from the Caribbean, really from all of the countries that have been allied with Cuba, both in terms of its international solidarity perspectives, that is, that they have been recipients of the health care and other kinds of support from Cuba, including in the armed struggle in the case of the overthrowing apartheid in South Africa. So it was a time of mourning, but also a time of spirited elevation on the part of the crowd. And people stayed there for the entire 5 hours or so. We arrived at around 5:30. I think the program may have started about an hour and a half later, around 7. And it was around 11 o'clock, a little after 11 o'clock in the evening, which it concluded. And I literally saw almost no one leave, although obviously I was not watching every exit.
Right. Okay, so we're going to start showing some of the clips of interviews that were done on the streets. These were produced by a local production company for us. Now, I need to contextualize this a bit. I've been to Cuba, I guess, 3 times now. You can find people in Cuba that are extremely critical of the Cuban government. You find some that are quite critical of Fidel Castro. You find many who are very supportive. Cuba is divided in terms of its public opinion on the success or lack thereof of socialism in Cuba. The interviews that we're going to play are all relatively positive in terms of their people's opinion of Fidel and the legacy. And we asked the production company to ask questions about Fidel's legacy, as well as how they felt about the new developing U.S.-Cuban relations. And in the end, we also asked about what they thought about Donald Trump and how that might affect things. So the first clip is an answer to the question, what were Fidel Castro's accomplishments? And here's a typical answer.
Hizo muchas cosas cuando empezó, ¿me entiendes? La campaña de federalización nos liberó así, le dio cultura a un pueblo. La medicina gratis, la educación gratis, la posibilidad a todos los estudiantes de ir a la escuela, de no tener que pagar para que la atiendan en el hospital. Son cosas muy importantes, ¿me entiendes? Ayudó a los campesinos con la ley de reforma agraria, la ley de reforma urbana, la propiedad de los inquilinos que la habitaban. Hizo cosas muy importantes para su pueblo.
So this summation of Castro's accomplishments is something you hear, obviously, from people that are supportive and sympathetic. What do you make of that list that the young man gives?
Well, in the first instance, not unlike every other society on the planet, I make that this is a culture of nationalism in which the head of state, be she or he a president or a prime minister, people are socialized as seeing that as a concentrated expression of them, the individual. So there is a kind of respect and sometimes an outright reverence for that position and that individual. For a young person of 20 some years of age who would not have been around during the revolution, these are things that they have learned intellectually in school historically or through conversations with parents and neighbors. And I think it represents that Fidel Castro, in the most general sense, was their major president, perhaps in the history of the country. It does not suggest that the individual would be in agreement with each and every policy or each and every step that Fidel Castro took. But I think in general, it is a true generalized reflection of where most of the people in the country stand, even when they have criticisms about one or another policies, or the minority, a very small minority, who I think would have differences about the socialist direction of the Cuban Revolution.
So then the question was asked, what do you think about the changes that are happening now, both in terms of the economy, relations with the United States?
Y como dijo Martí, el que no tenga enemigos porque nunca ha hecho nada en la vida, nunca ha hecho nada. El que no tenga, con contrario, no tenga detractores. Y a 90 millas, todos los problemas que nosotros pasamos, o el mayor por ciento de problemas que pasamos, volviendo al problema del legado, es precisamente, a mi entender, porque tenemos a esa gente enfrente. Si no hubieran hecho la guerra, porque hemos nacido en una guerra, tenemos una guerra constantemente con eso, creo que esa es la cosa de hacerla a pesar del enemigo. Y todo el mundo sabe que el imperio norteamericano es el imperio más grande que ha habido, el más poderoso a través de la historia de la humanidad, no es de ayer para acá, de la historia de la humanidad. Y nos dejó eso, y nos dejó ese legado. Y yo muy particularmente considero que seríamos muy cobardes si dejamos caer esa bandera. Muy cobardes. Tenemos errores, lo que tenemos. Algunos son de bloqueo y otros son nuestros, internos, mal trabajo, etcétera, cosas que pasan. Pero cuando tú metes la mano en el saco, te das cuenta de que hay muchas cosas que son errores, que tienen también su esencia en el mismo bloqueo.
So James, the blockade is a big part of the narrative in Cuba, and most certainly the American blockade of Cuba caused it damage, restricted its growth, made it more difficult for it to buy things on the international market, and when they did, it was much more expensive. But on the other hand, it often seemed to me sometimes that the blockade became somewhat, what should I say, an excuse for not having solved some of the problems that perhaps should have been able to be solved in Cuba. For example, the sort of weakening and almost destruction of Cuban agriculture, so that an island that one would have thought should have been self-sustainable in terms of its food was very dependent on buying chicken and other things from abroad. What do you make of this question of the blockade that's raised in this clip?
Well, I think without question, the blockade was a consistent and major hindrance to a more naturalized development of the Cuban Revolution. But let's quickly talk about what the blockade is. In the first instance, the blockade is the arrogance and imposition on the part of the United States government against working within the protocols of nations to have an open and honest dialogue with the Cuban leadership of the revolution, finding where they may have had mutual interest, and then finding proper respectful modes in which to carry on their debate. The United States simply curtailed that by cutting off relations and then trying to starve the country to death. Notwithstanding that, the Cubans have been heroic and won in their suffering. They took the position that they would be self-determined and sovereign, and they consolidated and independent, and they consolidated their society in which people across the spectrum of economic differences in race and gender lost weight when the Soviet Union fell and they were unable to get the kinds of basic consumer goods that they needed. And they did that in a consolidated way, despite differences among them. And they did it with dignity. We must recall that when Fidel Castro stepped down in 2008 and his brother was, and he was nominated and approved by the National Assembly, Raul Castro said that the blockade was really killing them. But he also said to the public immediately that if that blockade were removed the next day, that Cuba would still be in trouble, that socialist revolution would still be suffering by its own errors and its own failures. So that I think it is an honest assessment of what the blockade was, but I think many Cubans also honestly assess what were the shortcomings and the weaknesses and the problems in the governance structure that did not pay off to really help advance the society, either at the rate that it wanted to move or in substantive areas that it needed to address.
So the next clip is an answer to the question, what do you make about U.S. influence, again, and also the sort of development of various kinds of capitalist forms in Cuba that for many years were not allowed. Here's a few different voices on this.
No va a ser, la influencia de Estados Unidos no va a hacer nada aquí con nosotros, no sé. Nosotros vamos a seguir siendo cubanos, vamos a seguir teniendo lo que tenemos.
No me parece bienvenido porque ellos son tramposos. En la vida son tramposos, ellos piensan que todo lo pueden obtener y para mí no es bienvenido. No.
Me parecería bien que viniera un cambio, pero un cambio que sin bloqueo, sin restricciones, ¿me entiendes? A ese cambio que me refiero.
No pienso que el país se tenga que abrir, porque el que ha podido salir de Cuba, el que ha podido viajar a Cuba, no creo que la receta de un capitalismo sea la receta más adecuada. El que ha tenido esa posibilidad de verla, de vivirla, sabe cuál cruel es y cuán desigual es para las personas. Entonces pienso que nosotros, en la medida que podamos mejorar nuestra situación, que se cumpla y se pueda seguir el sueño del comandante, pienso que el país va a seguir igual. Pienso que el país está tranquilo y seguirá tranquilo dentro del dolor y la tristeza en que estamos.
Yo voy a decir la verdad, yo estoy preocupado también por un posible incremento de Estados Unidos hacia Cuba, sí, porque ya ellos demostraron, incluso el presidente Obama cuando vino aquí a Cuba, él dijo que nosotros los cubanos hemos estado bloqueados más de 40 años, y él dijo que hay que cambiar la política hacia Cuba. Entonces sí, yo estoy preocupado porque ellos de una forma u otra, ellos van a querer apoderarse de Cuba, pero nosotros los jóvenes vamos a estar más fuertes, más firmes, como nunca, y siguiendo el legado del comandante.
Bueno, ellos siempre harán sus intentos, pero el pueblo es muy nacionalista. Eso nos hemos criado con esa fervor de patriotismo y creo que no, por mucho que ellos hagan, van a influir, como es lógico, pero no van a tener el éxito que ellos piensan.
Porque la salud va a ser de siempre gratis, los estudios va a ser gratis, todo. Este socialismo no es para que se acabe, es para que continúe.
So you can see that there's concern, there's discussion, there's debate about just how opening up Cuba, quote unquote, is going to affect things like free healthcare, free education. Just how disturbed, concerned are people about this policy, and how, I guess it's a little too soon to say, but with all these forms of capitalism developing in terms of private ownership and partnerships with foreign capital, which are not entirely new but are going to be at a much bigger scale, how much can the people defend the socialist character of the Cuban economy?
Well, I think in general there will be an attempt on part of the citizenry across different groups and different outlooks to try to defend some of the basic socialistic gains of the revolution, like free access to education, free health care, making sure that there is a welfare state, that you don't find children and adults sleeping in the street. But of course, there is also a large concern on the part of the stalwarts of the socialist revolution, both within the everyday citizenry and certainly within the Communist Party and representatives of the state, that there will be incursions, there will be negative influences, and I think they're ready to look at some of the compromises that they will have to make. They are already evidenced in the kinds of massive remittances that are coming from outside of the country, the class differences that begin to emerge, or the racialized differences that begin to emerge based on who is outside the country and who is not from a racial perspective. There is a real concern about the shortages of certain basic foods with the expansion of private enterprise home restaurants called paladars, where the Cuban government has recently capped the number of paladars because they're finding that some basic things like onions and vegetables are very difficult for ordinary people to find in the marketplace because these small-scale private enterprises are able to go and purchase, and prices are going up. And Raul Castro has recently spoken about that. So there is going to be some deterioration around the edges of what the Cuban Socialist Revolution heretofore was about. But there will also be some gains in individual imagination being expressed in self-employment and employing other citizens. But the fundamental issues of healthcare, welfare, education, culture, I think there will be a bold struggle on the part, certainly, of the governance structure, and I would say the majority of the citizens to uphold that.
Thanks for joining us, James. Thank you for joining us on the Real News Network, and we're going to continue this discussion in future segments on the Real News.